Fascinating facts, candid conversations, and some levity to lighten your day. This is the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio.
It is a marvelous Monday. So happy that you're with me for another week on the Cale Clarke Show. 1-888-914-9149. It's a toll-free number to call to talk to me. Hey, it's free. It's toll-free. It comes out of my salary. Might as well do it. You can also email me, Cale, C-A-L-E, at relevantradio.com. Great place to give us your questions, stuff you'd like us to cover on the show. And you can also hit me up on Twitter, at Cale Clarke, C-A-L-E, Clarke with an E. The show handle is at Cale Clarke Show. Well, today is August the 9th. It's the feast day of St. Edith Stein, and she's one of the coolest Catholic women of recent memory. And I've got another really cool Catholic lady who's going to be my guest today. She is a convert to Catholicism from atheism, kind of like St. Edith Stein. She kind of went into an atheistic period as well. And my guest today is a mom of 6. She is a writer. She is a speaker. She's a podcaster. And she's also a stand-up comic. She created and starred in the Amazon Prime comedy special called The Naughty Corner. Here's a clip.
Parenting is so hard. I have had to Google things like how to handle classroom bullying, what to do if your kid's teacher has an anger management issue. Oh. Other than that, homeschooling is going pretty well.
Love it. I love it. She is about to embark on a brand new fall comedy tour called the Minivan Fabulous Tour. That certainly sounds fab. And she joins me now from her home in Austin, Texas. Jen Fulwiler is my guest. Jen, thanks for making the time. How are you?
It is so great to be here. I'm a big fan of Relevant Radio, so I absolutely love joining you today.
Oh, thank you for saying that. It's so great to have you on. And Jen, before we jump into your latest adventures, I just in case, and shame on them if our listeners do not know your backstory, but I want you to take me back a little bit. I always like with my guests to do a little bit of an origin story here, to use a comic book term. Talk to me about where you grew up and what was it like growing up for you as part of what you called a happy atheist family?
Yeah, so I didn't know anything different. We just, atheism was very much, it was so much part of the air that I breathed that I didn't really question it. I never believed in God as a child. I didn't, not even once did I consider that God might exist. I always say that I got that from my dad. He was an atheist. And my mom was not. She was one of those people who just didn't talk about religion. I always say in my set that my mom is what philosophers call a Macyist, and that is someone who is more concerned with whether Macy's has an additional 30% off this weekend than whether there's a compelling case for a monotheistic God. But my dad and I specifically talked about the dangers of religion and why the atheistic worldview was the right one. And I moved around the country a lot, but I often lived in the Bible Belt. So that was not a popular thing, to be an atheist in the Bible Belt. And yeah, you can imagine. I mean, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Yeah. And I got really a lot of social rejection because of that. And then that left a really bad taste in my mouth about Christians. So I was just openly hostile to Christians and to Christianity by the time I got to college. I was really what you would call a militant atheist at that point.
Yeah, and yeah. Oh, you're not going to go to youth group tonight. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
So, and you've obviously written a lot about this. You've spoken a lot about this. You have a spiritual autobiography that was published by Ignatius Press a few years ago called Something Other Than God. So people, if they really want to do a deep dive, you tell a lot in that book. And was there a pivotal moment for you, though, that prompted you to maybe consider theism, considering belief in God for the first time? What was that?
There were a few. You can imagine that there are quite a few stepping stones going from lifelong militant atheism to Roman Catholicism. Yeah. But I think the biggest one was when my first child was born. I had been so immersed in the secular feminist view. I had always said that I didn't want kids. And, so much of our secular nonsense today is predicated on the premise that individualism is the highest and best goal of humanity. You have to be out for yourself. It's all about you. And feminism is very deeply steeped in that. It's a very individualistic worldview. So because of that, it had never really occurred to me to have children. I just assumed I would have a childless life. And so when I did have a child, and by the way, I am an only child and my husband's an only child.
Oh, wow.
And most of my friends were either only children or only had one sibling. I never had a friend growing up who had a sibling younger than the age of 7 or 8 in the house at the time. So I had only held 2 babies in my whole life, and my husband had never held a baby when our first child was born. And I started to question. I said, the love that I feel for this child, it seems to have a source outside of the atheist materialist worldview. I don't think I believe that the love that I feel for this child is just purely a chemical reaction in the human brain. And really what I let go of there is the dumb idea that is very pervasive in our culture of scientism, which is this belief that the scientific method can prove everything, that if you're not proving it in a laboratory, you shouldn't believe it. And I had just been so steeped in that. I took that for granted as an accurate worldview. But then I thought, something like love, how can you prove that your mother loves you? If you tell someone your mother loves you, you can't prove that with the scientific method. And I thought, maybe there are truths out there that can be true, that can be objectively true, that you prove it in a different way than science. And that was the big thing that shifted for me when my child was born.
You're listening to the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio. Jen Fulwiler is my guest, Catholic stand-up comedienne. She's an author. She's a podcaster, a social media maven. We're going to talk about all that later. Yeah, and you blogged about this too. Like your foray before the book, there was this conversion diary blog that you had, which chronicled your journey into theism. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. Well, the reason I was so excited to jump in is what I wanted to say is starting to explore Catholicism from lifelong atheism. Well, I had alienated all my Christian friends. I didn't have a lot of church-going friends. I found myself very alone, and that's a very hard thing when you're going through such a tremendous conversion, especially that so much of my identity was wrapped up in atheism. I felt like I was the only person on planet Earth who might be considering this Christian faith and eventually a Catholic faith. So I started the blog as a way to just find people to talk to about this. But an interesting footnote is the biggest thing that helped me with my loneliness is I think it was right 2005, 2006, my city, Austin, Texas, got Relevant Radio. And I would drive around. I was not Catholic. I wasn't even sure if I was going to become Catholic. But I'd put my baby in the car for his nap. I'd let him nap in the car. And I would drive all over Austin, just aimlessly, not going anywhere, just for a couple of hours, just so I could listen to Relevant Radio. That was a really pivotal part of my conversion.
Now, Jen, you know that we're going to turn that into a commercial, right? I mean, that's...
Yeah, right. Of course, happily.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a pledge drive coming up next week, so that's perfect timing. And not that you plan that, but that's great for us to hear, honestly. And we obviously, you're not alone in that. We get lots of calls from people who have had the similar experience, that Relevant Radio has been that friend that they needed. Whatever show hosts people are listening to, other callers. It's just such an amazing family, such an amazing community. So I'm so thankful that you said that. I'm so glad that Relevant Radio was part of your journey. And when you came back, well, not came back, but when you came into the Catholic Church, obviously, that probably raised a lot of eyebrows among your friends and family members. And you've got some really good jokes in the Naughty Corner set about when you told people that you were actually considering becoming Catholic. You got some interesting reactions, even from other Catholics about this, right?
Right, yeah. One of the lines that gets the biggest laugh is where I say, when I'm introducing the Catholic part of my set, I say, when people hear that I converted from atheism to Catholicism, they say, why would you leave the freedom of atheism for the Roman Catholic Church? And that's just the Catholics. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, it was a lot of sort of I remember I went to a college reunion of my husband's at this time, and we talked to a guy he knew who was Catholic, obviously not super practicing based on what he said next. But he just looked at us with such disgust. He said, "What? Wow. You're becoming Catholic?" He's like, are you raised Catholic? He said, "No, I don't think that's a thing. I don't think that people can join our church. I don't think you're allowed." And by the way, this was Yale. I mean, these are intelligent people. They know things. But this guy, dead serious, said, "I don't think that's a thing. I don't think you can just become Catholic."
You can only inherit it.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say, though, my dad, God rest his soul, he said, he raised me to not as much to be an atheist per se, but to seek truth and question assumptions. And I tell my atheist friends, be careful raising your kids that way because they'll become Catholic. And so when we converted, he didn't object at all. He said, I always raised you to seek truth and question assumptions. It seems like you have followed that that ethic in what you've done here. And so I don't get it, but I support it. And he was there at Easter Vigil. My husband and I both converted. In fact, when Joe and I got married, he was kind of a lapsed Southern Baptist. The only thing we had in common in terms of religion is that we were both anti-Catholic. So we entered the church at the same time. But my dad was very supportive. He said, well, this is exactly what I raised you to do. So good for you.
The critical thinking skills were so crucial. I love that. I absolutely love that. Jen Fulwiler, Catholic comedienne, writer, and podcaster, is my guest. And just getting back to your career and sort of how things began to take off from that point, I think there really exists the myth of the overnight success, in your field and in my field too. And in most cases, it's more like a 10-year overnight success at least.
Absolutely.
And for you, it was like sort of a 14-year process from your conversion to where you are now. So talk about how your career and really your ministry, because I know you see this as a ministry as well, how this path developed and how you got from there to where you are now.
It's a great story of following where God leads you one step at a time, because I felt called to be more public about my life and my story. I really felt like God was leading me that direction. I have a great devotion to Our Lady of Guadalupe. And so I really, through prayer, I very strongly felt that I was supposed to get my story out there. Mm-hmm. But this was in the midst of, I had 6 babies in 8 years.
That's incredible.
Which is why I'm never, when I do Catholic speaking events, I'm never asked to give the NFP talk. So this was, it was just no twins, one baby after another. And so obviously that wasn't the time for me to be hitting comedy clubs, being out late working on a set at some dive bar in Austin. That just wasn't comedy. Stand-up comedy was not on my radar at that time. So I did what I could. I wrote for the National Catholic Register as I was one of their writers, and I blogged, and I wrote my book with the Ignatius Press published. And that was the right thing for me in that season. I had so many little kids, and all of that were things that I could be flexible with as my family demands, they were just never ending. And then as the kids got older and seasons changed in life, that's when I started. I did Catholic radio for many years. And so that worked during that time. And then interestingly enough, I quit a stable daily national radio job. And I quit. That's why I left, because I felt God calling me to do stand-up comedy touring full time. And that was May of 2020. So if anyone wants career advice, I am here. That's just a brilliant move to do a business model where you're gathering people into small spaces and making them exhale air forcefully. That was my big move at the beginning of 2020. And that job had benefits for my whole family. It was such a crazy move. But my husband and I both, we really prayed about it. Mm-hmm. And oddly enough, we felt God telling us now is the time, even though it makes 0 sense on paper. And continuously, I've just seen God lead us one step at a time through that. And then just recently, I signed with United Talent, which is a top Hollywood agency. They represent Jeff Foxworthy, Nate Bargatze, Jim Gaffigan. They are Sebastian Maniscalco. They are as A-list as it gets. And they just signed me. And they know what my views are. They know I speak at pro-life fundraisers and, all that. I never saw that coming. I really didn't think I would ever work with, a Hollywood agency like that, but they are great people. They are super supportive of me. They fully support, my career and everything I'm doing. And so, it's been amazing how it works when you just kind of follow God one step at a time.
Jen Fulwiler is my guest on the Cale Clarke Show. I love that because you're really taking really a step of faith into the darkness, like during a pandemic year. I think a lot of people, would have looked at you at that time last year and said, she's on top of the world, she's an author, she's got her own radio show. But you've talked about this in other interviews. You said that at that time you had a profound lack of peace in your life, which I think would be surprising to people. And talk to me a little bit about what you were feeling inside and what, maybe a little bit more of a deep dive into what prompted you to take that move, to make that step.
Yeah, I love that question. So everything was great. I was on the air 2 hours a day, national platform. I total creative control over my show. It had a Catholic lens, but other than that, I had creative control. Books were doing well. I was working with HarperCollins. And now I had done a stand-up comedy tour at that point, and it was way more successful than we ever thought it could be. And we had some just truly providential moments of how my comedy special that is on Amazon Prime, the way that came together. A Catholic group filmed it. That is Spirit Juice Studios.
Yeah,
they work
Chicago.
with a bunch of, they're fantastic. So they're the ones who filmed that. And what's interesting is my agency, UTA, they said, when Netflix films a special, they only use 3 cameras. This is an 8-camera shoot in 4K. They're like, who did this? And I'm like, it's this Catholic group. They're called Spirit Jews. They're amazing. So all this stuff had happened. And really what it came down to, Cale, was that I started to notice that my time was being divided in a way that was just not working, because I do have 6 kids. I was on the air 2 hours a day. You know what goes into this. There's quite a bit of prep. Yep. And your schedule is utterly inflexible. When you do live radio, I'd either, if I flew somewhere, I'd have to take a red-eye flight or one early in the morning. You know this. And so then the stand-up comedy tour was starting to heat up. And so part of it was practical, that I said, my primary vocation is with my family. A spiritual director once gave me great advice. She said, when you're trying to discern something, first question you should ask is, how does it impact your primary vocation? And if you have a lack of peace there, if you're feeling stress among your children or with your spouse, you got to start there. Don't answer any other questions until you figure that out. And I just had to have a real, quite literally, a come to Jesus moment where I said that I don't think I can do both. I don't think I can be on the air 2 hours a day every day, because my kids are still, my youngest is 8. He was 7 or 6 at this point. And I said, I don't think I can be on the air 2 hours a day and do stand-up comedy touring and maybe writing other books or whatever. Like, I too only have 24 hours in a day.
Something's got to go.
Something is going to have to go here. And we really thought about it. We really prayed about it. And I said, I think it's the radio show. It sounded very impressive. It was a great credential for me. It was, I'd go to New York City all the time. I've interviewed celebrities, but I felt God telling me that, I'm not giving you 36 hours in a day. You only get 24 like everyone else. Something has to go. You got to choose comedy or radio. And we spent many, many weeks, months discerning this. And I felt like it was comedy, even though I had a nice salary and benefits for my whole family in radio, and a pandemic was starting. Oddly enough, I had that piece of the Holy Spirit when I chose comedy.
And that's definitely a good tip, that you're on the right track. You have that supernatural piece that accompanies the decision, that you don't feel. But obviously, what's happened since then has only validated that decision, which obviously would have looked crazy. And believe me, being in radio, I know exactly what that feels like. And people don't understand the amount of work that goes on behind the scenes to make these shows a reality. I know it sounds like we're just kind of riffing, but it's. I mean, some people do. Maybe some people just sit down, turn on the mic, and just start riffing. But obviously, you're a true professional, and you know how much work goes into this. And I just think your story is so fascinating. You're listening to the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio. My guest is Jen Fulwiler. When we come back, going to take a quick break here. We're going to talk about her early forays into stand-up clubs, how that went, how scary it was, and her really incredible methodology, how she knows which jokes are going to work. We'll get into that. We'll be right back. 888-914-9149. It's Cale Clarke Show.
Truth is not a concept. Truth is a person. Truth is the living person of Jesus Christ. And if you think of your search for spiritual truths as something that you just read about in books, as data that you evaluate, you will never fully understand what it is to encounter the truth.
This is the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio.
She's a woman who wears a lot of hats. Conference speaker. Just heard a clip from her speaking at the Seek Conference not long ago. Jennifer Fulwiler is my guest on the Cale Clarke Show. She's a stand-up comic. She's an author. She's a mom of 6, a podcaster who does a lot of cool stuff for her family, for the kingdom, and for the world. And Jen, just before the break, we were talking about how you started in comedy, how you had this very, very popular radio show you walked away from. A lot of people didn't understand that, but you had to kind of, pay your dues a little bit. You went into some stand-up clubs, and you wanted to break into the field. What was your strategy And how is stand-up comedy different from speaking on, say, stages on the Catholic conference circuit?
Yeah, this is so interesting. So I just started going down to comedy clubs here in my town of Austin, Texas, and no one had heard of me, so I couldn't get headlining bookings, of course. So I would go to just open mics at dive bars. And now luckily I'm a night owl, so I'd put the kids to bed, and my mom would sometimes come watch the kids, and my husband and I would go down to one of these places. My set wouldn't start until 11:15 at night. I mean, it was crazy. And you can imagine the people I'm hanging out with. This is not a lot of other Catholic moms down there. And that's where my background, lifelong atheist. Of course, you hear some just absolutely insane stuff on these stand-up comedy stages, but it didn't faze me at all because that's the world I come from. I knew, all the stuff these guys are into.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
As an aside, I'll answer your question about my process, but interestingly, a lot of lapsed Catholics in stand-up comedy, an enormous number of comics are lapsed Catholics. And what's interesting is everyone, because of my sets, everyone knows that I'm the token real Catholic in the comedy scene, certainly in the Austin comedy scene. And I'm respected. I mean, these people follow me. They're on social media. They're very kind to me. They love it when I'm on their shows. They're very welcoming. And a lot of them have had conversations with me where they ask me about going to church. They'll ask me questions about God. One of them said, I'm really searching in my faith, and I'd like to talk to you about it. And so it's so interesting when you follow God's plan. I was thinking sharing more of my journey and who I am and Catholicism and all that through things like my comedy special. And of course, I don't only talk about Catholic stuff, but that comes through when you talk about your life in comedy. But there's been this side note of a lot of the local comics have said they really appreciate my presence because it's just nice for them to have someone to talk to who is a person of faith. And I've been able to sort of, I think God's worked through me a little bit just by me being there, by me showing up to these shows. But so I needed to get my comedy set together very quickly. And because this tour that I was doing, I self-produced. I just called theaters, and my friend and I just booked them with my personal credit card. I would Google rent theater in Columbus, Ohio. Just found whatever Google result came up, we would call and just say, hey, can we rent your theater? Here's my credit card. When the first theater asked me for a rider, I didn't know what one was. I had to Google what is a rider, and I downloaded a sample from the internet and just put my name on it. It was just, it was insane. But because my personal money, we would have been in bankruptcy if this tour hadn't worked. So I needed to get my material together very quickly. Oh, yeah. So what I would do is I would record my sets and I would put them in a spreadsheet. I would literally put each punchline in a spreadsheet, and then I'm not even kidding, Cale. I had conditional formatting that would color code depending on the laugh level and then the time between laughs in my set.
I love
and
that.
It actually really helped me because it gave me a visual of where the dead spots were in my set, the jokes that were really hot with the jokes that I could build on. And people in comedy, one of the things that they're most blown away by is how quickly I came up with an hour of material. And it was really that spreadsheet is how I did it. It was just ruthless feedback in that format.
Well, I mean, you're obviously a real craftswoman here. And comedy is an art form, to be sure, but there's also a science to it. And I just love that, how you got the set right by using spreadsheets. That is so cool. And also, your home garage came into play in this too, right, Jen?
Yes. Okay. Oh, this is a great story because the word on the street was among people in comedy. By this point, I had some friends in comedy, and they said, Jen, look, women who have children don't succeed in comedy. You really almost never see it, especially as clean comedians. I mean, there's just a whole thing. And they said, it's just too much. You won't have the time, your responsibilities, blah, blah, blah. Everyone laughed at the idea that somebody with 6 kids could make any kind of dent in the serious comedy world. And I said, okay, well, we'll see. And again, this is where faith comes in, that when people ask how I did this in comedy, I'm like, I couldn't have done this if I didn't believe in God, really, because I didn't know what my plan was, but I just knew that God had called me to this. So I said, I don't know, look, God told me to do this, so I guess he'll figure it out. So what I did is, we have so many people in and out of our house because we have 6 children. We're involved in our church. There's just a constant flow of people in and out of our house. So I would do what I called garage comedy, where I would gather neighbors. I would tell my kids to tell their friends to have their parents come over. And so I could easily get 20, 25 people to sit in my garage. I would actually hand them printouts with my set list on it and have them rate it. I would read through my set, and then we would have a discussion afterwards, and they would give me great feedback where they would say, I just didn't understand this one joke, or, this punchline was super funny. You have to keep that in. And that allowed me to grow as a comic by leaps and bounds. And the great point of that is, if I hadn't had 6 kids, if I had the life that, the secular feminists, if you're going to do something with your career, you can't have kids weighing you down. Well, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish what I've accomplished in comedy if I didn't have this big Catholic family and in being involved in our church and all of that. So that ended up being my ace in the hole.
Yeah, that's incredible. My guest is Jen Fulwiler, Catholic stand-up comic. And by the way, we had a caller call in and say, how do you spell her last name? It's Fulwiler. So Jen Fulwiler, you can look her up. She's on Twitter. She's all over the place. We're going to tell you how you can connect with her later on. But I love that. And obviously, I just love the idea of like all these friends and family members sitting in the garage and you telling them, you have to be honest rating my jokes here, because if you're not laughing, like, don't give me a courtesy laugh here.
Right.
Because if you do, I'm going to flop in front of people, on stage, in my Amazon Prime special. I don't want that. So you got to be brutally honest here. And obviously, having 6 kids, in that sense was obviously a huge boon. Like there's tons of momedy is kind of a little bit of your brand comedy wise here. So there's probably a bottomless well of material. Are there any aspects of your family life that you would not touch or you don't want to mine for comedy gold?
Oh yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I don't say anything that would make my kids look bad. And a lot of, especially female comics, they are known for going into really, really intimate territory, shall we say. My husband would change his name and move to a cave if I ever did that. He would run up on stage and drag me off the stage if I ever made jokes along those lines. And so that is definitely a challenge as a comic. For example, I was writing with someone and they suggested I make some sort of joke that the punchline would indicate I don't like having kids. I'm like that my kids are annoying to me. And I said, that's just not true. That I try to speak from a pretty authentic place, and that's just not. I mean, sure, we all get on each other's nerves sometimes, but this particular joke made it sound like I fundamentally don't like being a mom. And they said, well, that's kind of part and parcel of domestic comedy done by females. And I said, that's not my perspective. I'm so thrilled about my family. I think it's a blast. I think it's so much fun. And so that does really challenge me as a comic, that I have to keep it clean. I don't talk about, marital intimacy. I don't complain about my kids. I don't tell embarrassing stories about them. I mean, unless I run it by them and they're okay with it. Yep. And so I really have to dig pretty deep. But it's led me to some material that I'm really proud of and that crowds seem to find pretty unique and interesting.
I love that. My guest is Jen Fulwiler, the creator and star of The Naughty Corner on Amazon Prime Video. It's an awesome comedy show. It is clean. And Jen, clean comedy is so much harder. I mean, it's so easy to go for the cheap laugh with vulgar material, and you obviously know this. And to do family humor but not put your family in a bad light I hadn't thought about that before, how tough that must be. And obviously just listening to your show, I mean, we know, Jen, there's a huge continuum, if you will. There's a spectrum of Catholics. There are those on one end who obviously really practice the faith, who really believe it, buy into it, those who don't. And there's also on one end of the Catholic community, if you will, there's a certain, I don't want to stereotype anybody here, but there's a certain type of Catholic lady who, is always kind of sorrowing, maybe never wants you to, never smiles at Mass or anything like that. Would never. And when they hear that you're a Catholic comedienne, and then you start cracking jokes about, say, drinking vodka surreptitiously out of a Hello Kitty travel mug at a PTA meeting, do you ever get calls or emails saying, well, I never, and you're a sorry excuse for a Catholic mom or whatever? And has anybody ever said anything like that to you? And how do you deal with it?
I absolutely do. Although, what's interesting is since I have begun labeling myself as a stand-up comic, I don't get that as much. When I was a radio host in Catholic media, then there was a little bit more pearl clutching. And I think that's one of the reasons maybe it was best that I quit that job and didn't do a radio show, because people would tune in expecting ministry and serious Catholic talk. And you can imagine you turn your radio dial and I'm making jokes about drinking alone in my garage. And they're like, oh, whoa, this is not the ministry that we expected.
Yeah.
So I do have a little less of that now that it is no, I'm a comic. I'm making jokes. I focus on the lighter side of life, and people do seem to emphasize that. But what's interesting, Cale, is some of the women who initially tisk me have come around. Like they'll follow up later and they'll say, you know what, I really needed a laugh today. I get it now. I was just having a bad day. So I always try to remember that sometimes when people, lash out at me, that they're just having a bad day.
Yeah, and you know what? And obviously, like when you were talking earlier, Jen, about speaking to some of these lapsed Catholic comics that you come into contact with, people in these dive bars or whoever, this is kind of what it's all about when you're doing ministry on the fringe and on the edge of society, because that sort of pearl clutching stuff is not going to interest those people who are kind of, they've walked away and they're like, why would I want to be Catholic? So you almost have to have a bit of that edge to you, don't you think, in order to do that?
For sure. I'm always speaking to the person who I was when I was an atheist. And that's one of the reasons that I veered more into traditional stand-up comedy and away from Catholic media. I almost think of it as like, it's special ops evangelization. I'm not as much publicly wearing the uniform now, but it's actually a deeper dive into my mission. And early on, when I first converted to Catholicism, this was 2007, we came into the church and I said, God, I'm so thankful for what you've done in my life. I'm so profoundly grateful to be Catholic. All I ask is that you help me reach people who are where I used to be. That's all cool. I ask. Just give me that mission. Let me do that. And what I found in Catholic media is I still speak at Catholic conferences, and obviously I love coming on your show, this sort of thing. But I found that too often I was only speaking to the people who are already bought in. Yeah. And I've been praying about that for years. I said, Lord, I know I can reach people. I know I can, because I spent so many years in that space. And many of my friends are still in that space. And so I feel like this is, in a way, this leaving Catholic media and going into just traditional stand-up comedy in the secular world is actually closer to the mission that I always prayed to have.
I really like that. You haven't because a lot of people probably looked at what you were doing and said, "Oh, she's gone secular. She's chasing fame, she's chasing glory." But really, it's a deeper dive into the original apostolic mission, really, that you see for yourself. And I just love that. Jen Fulwiler is my guest right now on the Cale Clarke Show, stand-up comic. And when we talk about comedy, there's really a great tradition, obviously, of Jewish comedy. I think about Jackie Mason. I'm sure you know that he started off as a rabbi, and his sermons were so funny that people said, man, you should really go into comedy. He's like, well, I never thought of that, but maybe this is what God wants me to do. And that's a little bit like what happened to you, because during your conference talks, you'd obviously throw in a lot of humor, and on your radio show too. And that was something that kept coming back to you. People would say, man, I love the jokes. And I did want to, I think you sort of alluded to this a few minutes ago, but was stand-up comedy something that you always wanted to do? Like even when you were younger, was that sort of a dream that you had in your youth, or?
Oddly enough, not really. It's a strange thing. I always respected it, and I was a fan of stand-up comedy, and I was even a humor writer way back in the day before my conversion to Catholicism. I had a website where I did humor writing, and I had a lot of humor pieces go viral. So I knew that I gravitated toward comedy and comedic writing, but I think for so many years, I was so much in writer mode that I would watch stand-up comedy specials. I would appreciate them, but it just never occurred to me to see myself on that stage. And I think maybe that's how radio was a transition, that I thought, well, I really do I like using comedy verbally as well. So what can we do with that,
I love that. And there's obviously a great, people don't really see this so much, but there's a great tradition of Catholic comedy as well. And as you know, tomorrow is the feast day of, I don't know if there's more than one, but he is the patron saint of comedians, St. Lawrence the Martyr, right. who was as he was being martyred, as he's being roasted alive on a gridiron, he famously quipped, I'm done on this side, you can turn me over now. How is comedy and laughter an integral part of what it actually means to be Catholic and what it means to be human?
Well, yeah, and by the way, I want to know, I think every single late night host was raised Catholic. Whether or not they're practicing now is a different story. Yeah. And again, I see this in stand-up comedy. Austin is not a particularly Catholic city, but when I do shows here in Austin, let's say 10 comics are going up, it's not uncommon for 7 or 8 of them to be raised Catholic. So I think there is very clearly a connection to that, the worldview that you get steeped in when you're raised Catholic and comedy. And as an aside, I would say, and also obviously there's a great tradition of Jewish people being in comedy as well. Mm-hmm. And I think our monotheistic worldview is it's so no nonsense, and it has it has a very clear-eyed view of what the world is and what our purpose is. It gives you a lot to play with in terms of humor and comedy. So I think that one of the things that I'm sorry, remind me what your question is.
It's just like how comedy and laughter is an integral part of what it means to be Catholic and human.
Yeah. Because, we know that one of the most dangerous sins, if not the most dangerous, is the sin of pride. Nothing will separate you from God more quickly than pride. I think Chesterton has a great quote about that if I only had one sermon to preach, it would be on pride. And so when you think about it, humor is all about humility. And I think it was also Chesterton who said that humor is this beautiful thing because on the one hand, the reason we can laugh is because man has dignity. If a fly bumps into a window, that's not funny because the fly doesn't have any dignity. If a man bumps into a window, that's kind of funny because you're juxtaposing that with his inherent dignity. So on the one hand, humor reminds us, it's predicated on the dignity of the human person, but it's about humbling ourselves. If you have a very arrogant view of yourself and of the world, you are not going to be able to laugh and you're not going to be able to be funny. And so I think that I really see the beauty of comedy, that it just relieves our burdens by reminding us that, God is in charge. This is all just silly. And let's have a little bit of humility here.
I love that. And people also forget that Jesus was really funny. And I don't think it necessarily comes across to modern readers, but Hebrew humor is all about humor by exaggeration. So when he's saying, hey, before you take the speck out of your own eye, try pulling the telephone pole out of your own eye. I mean, people would have been in stitches listening to this guy. I mean, he's really, really funny and sarcastic in a lot of ways. And so I do think, going back to Christ himself, humor has always been part of the Catholic package, properly understood. You're listening to the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio. Jen Fulwiler, Catholic stand-up comic, is my guest, and we're going to be back right after this really quick break. Hang with us. You won't want to miss what's coming up next. Catholic Order of Foresters is proud to sponsor the Relevant Radio studio line. For information about employment opportunities and flexible premium life insurance plans, visit relevantradio.com/Forester.
You just have all of these stereotypes that Catholics curse and they drink and they're irresponsible with family planning. And now I am those stereotypes.
Faith, facts, and fun. It's the Cale Clarke Show on Relevant Radio.
All right, that was Jen Fulwiler, who's my guest today, convert to Catholicism, mom of 6, writer, speaker, podcaster, stand-up comic, the creator and star of the Amazon Prime comedy special, The Naughty Corner. And Jen, what I really liked, my wife Trish and I, when we were watching The Naughty Corner show, what we thought was really cool was that at the end of the show, I mean, you didn't really go for a big pyrotechnic, blast us out of the water with like your greatest joke ever. You did something kind of different. You talked about people and the pain that they experience in their day-to-day lives. And I thought it was a really amazing way to end the show, because I have to ask you, is this a direct choice that you made because of what you went through with your dad? And maybe you could just tell the audience a little bit about that.
Yeah, what happened was I'm an only child and my dad was an only child. So we were very close and we saw him every day. He did dinners at our house once a week. He took my kids to all of their activities, and my parents are divorced. So he was very, very close to our family. So, and I mean, he was our free family chauffeur. My kids rode with him everywhere to everything. And I think it was about 4 or 5 weeks before I filmed the Naughty Corner special out in Chicago. I was in Atlanta, actually the city I was born in, and I got a call the night before that show that he died. And I thought, I mean, it was just such a shock. I thought I had just been texting with him. I thought I must be misunderstanding something. He had an internal bleeding issue, and it just got out of control. And so I was just thinking about comedy and why we do this. And one of my big things is I always want to honor the time that people give me, the money they spend to come to my shows. I really think about that I want to make sure that I am making this worth people's while. And I think for those of us who are Catholic and any parents and really all of my fans, we have some serious struggles. I mean, my fans are not like a lot of the fans of some of these young guys who I'm good friends with. I love these guys, but they're like 25 and all their friends are 22-year-old, 25-year-old guys. They have different struggles than we do. And I mean, I had people coming to that show who had lost children, who like me had lost parents, who had been through really, really difficult things. And I just felt moved to say, I see you. And yeah, we are here to laugh, but I'm doing this because we have a lot of pretty serious burdens, all of us. And I see you, and I'm doing this to relieve your burdens. And it was my first comedy special, and this was my debut in the comedy scene. You only get one shot to make a debut. So I wanted to send a message to my fans and to the comedy world. Yes, of course I want to make people laugh, but I do have a bigger mission, and I want to make sure everyone knows that.
I think it really worked. It was so different. It was really striking.
I'm so glad you think that.
Yeah, well, I mean, my wife in particular was like, wow, that is so cool. I've never seen anybody do that before. So that was amazing. So I encourage everybody to check that out. If you have Amazon Prime, you can check it out. It's The Naughty Corner with Jennifer Fulwiler. And I want to kind of shift gears to another medium right now, Jen, that of the printed page. Your latest book, which recently came out, was called Your Blue Flame, Drop the Guilt, and Do What Makes You Come Alive. And my experiences with Blue Flames involved being in junior high school, lighters, and
yes,
methane.
I found that out after the book was published.
Contributing to the natural gas industry. I'll just leave it there. I'll just leave it there.
Yes.
But that's obviously not what you're going for with that image. So what is this book all about?
Yes, and by the way, I found that out in a live interview when I was promoting the book. I was like, what? So yes, so that is not, I'm not talking about lighting certain bodily functions on fire. No, it was about, so this is a mission that I have, that when I converted to Catholicism and I had all these babies, of course, many of my female friends also have a lot of babies. They've got a lot going on. And I saw many of them, out of a well-meaning sense of doing the right thing, really taking themselves out of any kind of hobby, any kind of quote unquote work, broadly defined. I don't mean career in the traditional sense, but they would have this mentality that we get from actually secular American culture, that if I have young children, I need to put everything on hold, my hobbies, any kind of work I feel called to do, until the children are older. But what I've seen over and over again, that actually comes from what John Paul II calls the culture of death. This idea that you would only be in your childbearing years for a very, very short window. So you can put everything on hold for the 3 or 4 years that you're having children. And then that's done and over. And then you move on to your quote unquote real life. And what I saw in some of these great Catholic communities that I got involved in, like visiting places like Lafayette, Louisiana, and a lot of the deeply Catholic parts of this country, is children they're just part of everything. And babies are part of everything. And so if a woman felt called to do something, whether it's paid work or whether it's, maybe being a seamstress for her community and doing some things on the side and making some really beautiful dresses, it would never occur to her not to do that when she has young children, because having young children is just part of life. Even as your kids get older, you'll hopefully, God willing, have grandchildren underfoot. And so if you as a woman don't follow your passions until quote unquote the kids are older, well, you'll never do what God might be calling you to do in terms of additional contributions, because you might have children underfoot forever, great grandchildren after the grandchildren. So that book was really a mission that was another one of my stealth, like that was a culture of life point I was trying to make, that if you feel that God is calling you to love the world in some way through some sort of contribution, don't put that on hold. Do it now. Even if, like me, when I wrote my first book, in the middle of having 6 babies in 8 years, of course, I could not do this 40 hours a week. It was during nap time. It was early in the morning. It was late at night. But don't put that on hold, because we need voices in the marketplace of ideas of open to life women. Like when I was an atheist, I never heard from women who had a bunch of little kids because they were silent. They were out of the marketplace of ideas. And so that was really my rallying cry to say, hey, moms, if there's something on your heart to go out there and do, there is a way to do it with a baby on your hip and a toddler at your side.
Oh, man, that is so powerful. And I think a lot of people listening right now on Relevant Radio needed to hear that. We obviously have a lot of women and men listening to the show. And it's important not to put off the dream that God has put on your heart. And here's a little clip that we've got. And Luke, if you just want to play this little clip from Jen talking about some of this stuff.
Ladies, be good mothers this summer and spend time with your children the traditional way. Which doesn't involve any of this, because traditional mothers were busy. For most of human history, survival was a mom's full-time job. If your kids wanted chicken nuggets, it was up to you to take it from chicken to nugget. Without refrigeration, food had to be cooked daily. Without indoor plumbing, getting water was a whole ordeal. The laundry spin cycle was your bare hands. And without electricity, this all had to be done during daylight hours. There is no historical precedent for moms being the primary entertainers of their kids. They never had time. Meaningful moments with their children happened, but it was in the midst of their busyness or in the evenings. Maybe traditional moms pinned clothes on clotheslines and you pinned clothes on Pinterest. Either way, it's natural and normal for a woman to have a lot of her daily focus on something other than entertaining her kids. Hug your kids, love your kids, tell your kids you're thrilled to be doing life with them, and then unapologetically make time for your own adult work, because that is what traditional motherhood looks like.
You got a lot of hot takes, Jen, on your Instagram channel.
And that one went viral on TikTok too, which was really funny. I joke with my kids that I'm a TikTok star.
Yeah, and you really are a TikTok star. You know, a little humility there, but it's true. You had obviously a post that went viral talking about moms with screaming kids on planes. And can you just speak to that for just a second?
That was so exciting, because I said in that sketch, I was like, man, this'll never get shared by anyone, because I said that our society not being welcome to babies is the sign of a dying culture. Yeah. So I was like, all right, no one's going to share this. That got picked up by Good Morning America, The Today Show, Fox News, Newsweek, Australian News. It was everywhere. I've never had more media coverage to anything I've done. And it's also kind of the most pro-life sketch I've done recently. I was really shocked that one got around as much as it did. But yeah, I was making the point that the sound of babies fussing and crying, accepting that is actually the sign of a healthy, thriving culture.
And it's not just on planes, in church too. I mean, in the church, you'll get a dirty look if your child makes a noise. And some of the stuff you just don't understand until you do have a child yourself, and then it's like, wow, I mean, now you totally appreciate what these people are going through, the struggles they're making just to get to Mass.
Right.
But, so it's like, well, what do you want me to do? I think you've said this somewhere before, bring the kid back when he's like 18. I mean, come on.
Right.
I mean, so anyways, there's so much we could say about that. But I really love your focus on that, on chasing the dreams that God has put on your heart. And we only got a couple minutes left here, Jen, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about your husband, Joe, and his role on this big roller coaster that you've been on over the past few years, how he helps you, how he supports you and your family.
Yeah, he's incredible. He has his own incredible story. He was raised by a single mother, very, very poor, and her big focus was just getting them out of poverty. She came from generational poverty, barely finished high school, and she had heard kind of in pop culture about places like Yale and Harvard, and she told him to go to one of those places just to break this cycle. He ended up going to Yale for college, graduated in 3 years with honors, Columbia Law School, Stanford Business School. But what's interesting is he really took over sort of the running of the house and homeschool with this comedy stuff. And I often joke, I thought, man, I bet when you were at Yale or when you were doing billion-dollar merger, he was a lawyer in New York City for a while. And I said, yeah, I bet you would not imagine that you would be, not doing these big deals. Like he cut back his work very significantly to, someone has to manage some of the stuff with the kids. And even though I'm still very involved as well, he just had to cut back his work. And he's totally at peace with it. He's thrilled. He really enjoys kind of being my manager and giving me advice and helping me work on comedy. And it has really been a beautiful thing in our marriage. We very much enjoy partnering on this. And I always tell people that's one of the ways that that your family will build up whatever it is you're called to do it as a family. I don't see this as my solo work. My kids help me with my comedy. My kids constantly give me suggestions about what I can be doing on TikTok. It's very much a family affair.
Yeah, and it was so great. We only got about 30 seconds left. When you brought your whole family up for that curtain call at the end of the Naughty Corner show on Amazon Prime, everybody should go watch that. It's just amazing. But talk about, just real quick, how can people find you online, and how can they find about your upcoming comedy tour, the Minivan Fabulous Tour?
Yes, I will be announcing cities soon. You can sign up for my email list, and you guys will get first access to tickets. jfcomedytour.com. I know nobody can spell Fulwiler, so it's jfcomedytour.com. Instagram is my favorite social media platform, so if you search for me, just search for Jennifer Fulwiler on Instagram, and I will come right up.
We'll put a link to all those fabulous places in the show notes. Jen Fulwiler has been my guest today. Jen, it was so great to run you down. Thanks for taking the time.
What a pleasure. And keep up the great work that you guys are doing on Relevant Radio. It was pivotal in my conversion, and I just really support what you guys are doing.
Oh, thank you, Jen. And best of luck with the comedy tour. I can't wait to hear your new set. It's going to be great. It's going to be great.
All right, thank you.
You got it. Jennifer Fulwiler, if you need her. Man, producer Lucas, what a great show. Amazing, amazing job. And I just can't say enough about her comedy, what she's doing, how she's reaching so many souls through her work. Jennifer Fulwiler. It's been a great show. The Cale Clarke Show will be back tomorrow with another hot episode. We will see you then. Take it away, Michaela.
Thank you for listening to my daddy.